In 1977, in Brooklyn, there was a Saturday morning ritual. A line of grown men forming outside an electronics store on Kings Highway. Not for bread, not for concert tickets, for an amplifier demo. They held printouts torn from Stereophile magazine. They argued about copper cable versus silver. They spent 2 months of their salary on a single pair of speakers and considered it a bargain. 5 years later, an invention from Sony and Philips would arrive that promised to make all of it obsolete. 3 words on the box: perfect. Sound. Forever. They were lying, and the people who knew it were ignored for the next 30 years until the numbers finally proved them right. This is the story of the golden age of hi-fi, the era when humanity, for the first time in its existence, fell genuinely in love with the sound of recorded music and built temples of brass, copper, and beryllium to worship it. It's also the story of how that golden age was killed in a single boardroom decision in 1982. How the men who killed it spent the next 2 decades pretending they hadn't. And how, 40 years later, the dead technology came back and quietly buried its replacement. The pattern repeats one more time. One fatal decision. To understand what we lost, you have to understand what came before. After World War II, the world was rebuilding, and music became the way back to feeling alive. Jazz exploded across Europe and America. Rock and roll arrived. But there was a problem. There was almost nowhere to actually hear music played at full force. Radio sounded thin and flat. Gramophones creaked. The first reel-to-reel decks were the size of a small refrigerator and cost as much as a car. Then, in 1959, an American company called Fisher released the Model 600. 22 glowing tubes, $350. The first mass-market stereophonic receiver. Stereo wasn't just an upgrade, it was sorcery. Suddenly the violins moved to the right, the double bass to the left. The drummer was sitting in the middle of your living room. People hearing it for the first time literally jumped off the couch and looked behind the wardrobe just in case. But Fisher was just the prologue. The real golden age needed 3 forces to converge at once: Japanese manufacturing, the Western music revolution, and, for the first time in human history, a middle class with disposable income to spend. By the late 1960s, all 3 were in the room. The Japanese rewrote the rules. Before Marantz, Pioneer, Sansui, Kenwood, and Sony scaled up, hi-fi was the domain of hobbyists soldering kits from magazine schematics, or millionaires buying British Quad and American Macintosh. Now, the average office worker could buy a serious amplifier and decent speakers for 1 or 2 months of salary. In 1978, Pioneer released a single product that captured the entire era: the SX1980. 270 watts per channel, 78 pounds of transformer iron. Distortion so low it was, and I'm quoting the spec sheet, essentially unmeasurable. $1,295 in 1978. About $6,000 in today's money. And people lined up to buy it. In 1974, Yamaha released the NS1000M speakers, the world's first speakers ever built using 99.99% pure beryllium for the tweeter and mid-range. A metal so light and stiff that the tweeter dome weighed 0.03 of a gram, about as much as an eyelash. To make it, Yamaha invented a process called electron beam vacuum vapor deposition. They built it because the engineering was possible. National broadcasters in Sweden and Finland adopted it as a studio reference. 50 years later, those speakers still sit in working studios. In 1982, Nakamichi released the Dragon, the cassette deck that automatically aligned its own playback head to match the magnetization of whatever tape you put in it. An engineering challenge so absurdly difficult, most companies didn't even attempt it. $1,850 in 1982. About $5,800 in today's money. People bought it anyway. This was hi-fi at its peak. Built like aircraft, priced for grown-ups. Designed to last 30 years and be passed down to your children. Here's the part most people forget. None of this was nostalgia or status. The music itself demanded it. Try listening to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon through a cheap radio. You'll hear noise. Listen to it through a Marantz 2285B and a pair of NS1000Ms. You hear architecture. These are not the same experience. And the people of that era knew the difference. That's why they paid. But somewhere, in a glass tower in Tokyo and another in Eindhoven, two engineers were building the thing that would erase all of it. And the worst part? One of them had already invented the format the new technology would replace. His name was Lou Ottens, a Dutch engineer at Philips. In 1963, working out of a lab in Hasselt, Belgium, he built a wooden block the exact size of a pack of cigarettes and used it to define the dimensions of a new audio format, the compact cassette. Ottens believed convenience mattered. His cassette was originally meant for dictation machines, but by the late 70s, the Japanese had pushed cassette quality so far that serious music lovers took it seriously. Over the next 60 years, the world would buy 100 billion of his cassettes. But Lou Ottens wasn't done. In the late 1970s, he joined the team at Philips that was working with Sony on something even bigger, a digital format. A small silver disc, sampled at 44.1 kHz, 16 bits per sample. On October 1st, 1982, in Tokyo, Sony shipped the world's first compact disc player, the CDP-101, 168,000 yen, about $730. The first commercial disc was Billy Joel's 52nd Street. The marketing slogan was 3 words, perfect sound forever. No hiss. No crackle, no flipping the record, no cleaning the stylus. You could skip to any track in a second. And critically, the marketing material claimed, the audio quality was mathematically superior to anything analog could ever achieve. It was the most important sentence ever written about sound. It was also a lie. The first audiophiles to hear a CD said the same thing. It sounds glassy, brittle, fatiguing, cold. They weren't imagining it. There's a real engineering reason. To prevent digital aliasing, sounds above the listening range folding back into the audible spectrum as ugly artifacts, every CD player needs a low-pass filter that cuts everything above 22.05 kHz. But the sample rate of 44.1 kHz only gives engineers a transition window of 2 kHz to do that. 2 kHz to drop the signal to nothing. In the 1980s, that meant aggressive analog filters, 9-pole, 13-pole, filters that introduced phase distortion right where the human ear is most sensitive, the upper mid-range. The result was a coloration the audiophile community had never heard before, a flatness, a loss of air, the thing that makes a cymbal sound like a cymbal and not a hiss. Audiophiles screamed. They were dismissed as cranks clinging to nostalgia, because for 95% of the population, convenience won. No more flipping records, no more cleaning needles, CDs in the car, skip any track in a second. That was stronger than any argument about analog warmth. By 1988, 6 years after launch, CD sales surpassed vinyl in the United States. By 1993, vinyl revenue had bottomed out at $10.6 million. Pressing plants closed. Entire catalogs of jazz and classical never made the transition. And the equipment changed too. Why build a 78-pound transformer if the digital signal is stable? Why use expensive capacitors if the listener can't hear the difference? Equipment got lighter, cheaper, worse. The generation that had saved up for a Marantz in 1977 was buying a $100 all-in-one boombox by 1995.
Then it got worse. Because CDs had no physical limit on loudness, there's no needle to bounce out of the groove, record labels began compressing every recording harder and harder and harder, year after year. Engineers called it brickwalling. The dynamic range, the difference between the quietest and loudest moment of a song, collapsed. By 2008, it had reached its absurd conclusion. Metallica released Death Magnetic, an album so overcompressed on CD that the master clipped and distorted on its own peaks. Fans started a petition demanding a remix. The Guitar Hero version of the same songs, built from the unmastered studio stems, sounded objectively better than the album you bought in stores. 25 years of recordings, an entire generation of music, were permanently damaged in pursuit of louder. All because the format made it possible, and the boardroom said yes. Perfect sound forever, indeed. In 2007, something started moving. Vinyl record sales in the United States, which had been left for dead since 1988, jumped 85% in a single year. On April 19, 2008, 300 independent record stores ran the first Record Store Day. Roughly 10 exclusive vinyl releases: Death Cab for Cutie, REM, Vampire Weekend. On a graph, it looks like someone flipped a switch. Sales doubled, then doubled again. In September 2020, a number arrived that nobody saw coming. For the first 6 months of the year, vinyl record revenue in the US, $232 million, surpassed CD revenue. $130 million. First time since 1986. 34 years. In 2022, vinyl outsold CDs in raw units for the first time since 1987. 41 million records to 33 million CDs. In 2025, vinyl crossed $1 billion in US revenue for the first time since 1983. 46.8 million units, 19 consecutive years of growth. The 1973 Lynn Sondek LP12 turntable is still in production. Same machine, same factory in Glasgow. Over 50 years and counting. Vintage Pioneer SX 1980s sell on the used market for more, adjusted for inflation, than they cost new. Tube amplifiers are in a quiet renaissance. The dead technology won. There's a final detail to this story. Lou Ottens, the engineer who invented the cassette and helped develop the CD that killed vinyl, lived just long enough to see it. In September 2020, the RIAA report dropped. Vinyl had beaten CD revenue for the first time since 1986. 5 months later, on March 6, 2021, Lou Ottens died at age 94 at his home in Duzel, the Netherlands. The man who replaced vinyl outlived his replacement of his replacement. The lesson the audiophiles tried to tell us in 1983 was right. Convenience and quality are different things. Sometimes the slower, heavier, more demanding format is the one that lets you actually hear what the artist made. 40 minutes with a record on the turntable. No phone, no notifications, no skip button is not a waste of time. It might be the best use of it. If this story hit something for you, drop a comment and tell me what was the first piece of real audio gear you ever owned. A Marantz receiver? A Technics turntable? Your dad's Pioneer? Even a cheap cassette deck? I want to read every one. And if you want more stories about the technologies the world tried to bury, subscribe. There's a lot more coming.